Hello and welcome to this webinar on increasing strategy power through effective implementation. My name is Christina Foster of Foster What Matters. I'm a longstanding consultant to the AOK Networks project, and it's my pleasure to be presenting this webinar today. Let's get started. So as you know, AOK Networks have rolled out a new 5-year assessment planning action process for the Child and Family Initiative. This new process has 4 phases. Phase 1 focused on assessing child and family outcomes so that we could identify the outcomes where children and families were not reaching. Then once we identified our targeted problems, we went on to phase 2 where we then assess the early childhood system. And in this phase, we seek to understand how the system is or is not contributing to supporting families and getting their problems met or addressed. There we did a root cause analysis and identified some of the prioritized issues that we wanted to affect. In phase 3, then we moved on to strategy design, and this is where we design strategies to specifically address those root causes in the system that we identified as priorities. And then in phase 4 is where we move on to implementation, tracking, and learning and adapting our strategies until we are able to reach the desired results that we're after. While the training for this process has been presented linearly and is depicted linearly in the graphic, we know that the process is actually quite iterative in nature. Today we will take a look at the iterative nature of strategy design, effective implementation, and getting to our desired outcomes. Let's take a look at our objectives for today's webinar. First, we want to identify some of the key challenges of effective implementation. We also want to understand why system change efforts require an iterative strategy design and implementation approach. We'll also distinguish between a typical implementation approach and our continuous improvement implementation approach. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some tips on prototyping your strategies. So we began training for phase 4 at the fall coordinators meeting with an experiential team activity involving a tent pole. Most of you were there for that. What seemed like a straightforward activity and a simple objective proved to be more challenging than anticipated. Along the way, there were some small successes and eventually success, but before that, there was some frustration, people disengaging, changes in leadership, communication breakdowns, and more. It took many starts, stops, and adjustments before success was achieved. So let's take a closer look at some of the common implementation challenges, some of which we experienced during this activity. So one of the common implementation challenges is that we like to jump to quick action without clearly defining our strategy. I'm guessing that all of you can relate to this in some way or the other. We're always wanting to get to action, and rightly so, but sometimes we do so before we actually have a clear idea of exactly what it is that we're going to do to try to address the issue that we're facing with. Another challenge is that we fail to occasionally reflect on how the strategy is going. Again, we're so committed to taking action and getting things done that we fail to take time to just think about, well, how well is the strategy actually going? Similarly, there is often an unwillingness to adapt the strategy even when we realize it isn't quite working out as we had hoped. This commitment to action is strong and deep, and unfortunately, while it's a good thing, it also can get us in trouble when we refuse to realize that sometimes what we're doing isn't exactly what's best. We also tend to forget to track our progress and celebrate the small accomplishments that do happen along the way. We all know that systems change. We're trying to move mountains, and we don't move mountains overnight. And so for that reason, it's really important that we really do track our progress and that we help everyone see the small accomplishments that are adding up over time to actually eventually move that mountain. And so while that is important and we can acknowledge the need for that, often it's just part of what gets left behind in the shuffle. We also see a tendency for a few people to really drive the work while others become disengaged. And this is also quite frequently the case where there's a few very passionate people who are really close to the issue and really want to move the work along, which is wonderful. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have others who don't really see their role or think that the others got it, so they don't need to, there's anything that they can do to contribute. But over time, with fewer and fewer people supporting the initiative, the momentum can really start to fall off, and we may even find that we don't have the capacity to continue to do what we need to do to get to our desired result. There's also a challenge sometimes with being unaware of unintended consequences. So we may have a really great strategy that in some ways is actually creating the results that we desire, but in other ways it's creating some consequences that were not considered or that we even thought might be possible. So they were totally unintended, but we have to be aware of these things so that we can course correct and fix the problem. And then finally, sometimes even when we see the consequences or other barriers that pop up, we just kind of ignore them because it wasn't kind of part of our original scope of work. But unfortunately, without addressing those barriers, sometimes even the best work on the good strategies that we have in place will not succeed without addressing those other barriers. So let's look at a few more common reasons strategies fail, but this time let's look at it kind of through the lens of what are some of the design issues versus what are some implementation issues, because both can pop up and both are actually critical to address. So design issues. Sometimes it's that we have some strategies that are good, but they're just not quite powerful enough or well developed. So they're heading in the right direction. The intention is good. There may even be some parts of the strategy that are strong, but overall, the strategy is just what we would call weak. There's not enough to it that actually is going to be powerful enough to shift the system issues that we're targeting. So it may be that they're not powerful enough. It may be that they're just underdeveloped. It just needs a little more robustness to the strategy in order to actually be effective. Sometimes our strategies target the wrong issues or are too general in nature. So despite having done rigorous work on our root cause chains and identifying very specific issues within those chains that needs to change in order to get to better outcomes for children and families, sometimes in the strategy design process we can run astray. We can kind of lose focus, and then unfortunately we start to design strategies that aren't so focused on those issues, or they're focused on the wrong issues. We pick the wrong ones to focus on, and then therefore our strategies don't really align in a way that they need to. Another issue is that sometimes we can get really caught up in a strategy idea that comes from another place where it worked really well, but we fail to adapt that strategy to make sure it fits our local context or our local community. So we get fooled by the thought that, well, if it worked here, it can also work here. But when we have families who are different, a community that is different, we have to make sure those strategies are adapted in a way that really fit our families and our context. And then finally, strategies sometimes are also another way of being kind of weak or not powerful enough is because they are only targeting a few of the system characteristics that are needed to shift the system. And so for those of you who are familiar with the able change system characteristics, like mindsets and components and regulations and so on, those are just different ways of thinking about the system. And we know that for systems change to really take hold, we need to be addressing 2 or 3 different types of system characteristics so that we're teasing the system enough, we're shifting the system enough in enough different ways that it actually can be powerful enough to actually shift from its current way of doing things to a new way of doing things. And so if we're only focused on one particular kind of system characteristic, then it's likely that that alone will not be enough to actually create the change, and definitely not enough to sustain the change. So let's switch to implementation issues. There's some similarities here, but there's also some distinctions. So One is that strategies are good, but not implemented well. So maybe all these design issues that we just talked about weren't at all an issue for you. You really designed some great strategies, really on point, powerful. They were adapted if you were borrowing some ideas or from other places. You were addressing multiple system characteristics to really try to change that system in a number of ways. But somehow the implementation of those strategies didn't quite go as planned. And so even the best strategies, if not implemented well, will fail. Strategy implementation creates unintended consequences that lead to more problems. We never know when we're working in a complex system how our interaction, what kind of effect or impact it's going to have. And so it's critical that as we implement our strategies that we're always paying attention to what's happening as a result of this strategy or intervention that we put into place. Because we hope for really good end results, but sometimes actually unintended consequences can happen too that we must address. And then implementers do not recognize or address unanticipated barriers. So similar to what we talked about before, sometimes we can just be so excited about moving into action and moving our strategies along that we're not recognizing, we're not aware of unanticipated barriers, or we choose to ignore them because we feel like that's out of the scope or capacity of what we can do. But the reality is, if we don't figure out some way to address some of these barriers, it may be enough to impede our success overall. So there's another way I want to just briefly talk about or think about implementation challenges or barriers besides thinking about it from a design or an implementation distinction. I want to talk about two types of implementation barriers, one of which is knowable kind of barriers. So these are barriers that they're factual, they're predictable, they're anticipated. We can kind of know with some level of assurance that what the current state of these are. So for example, stakeholder engagement. We need to be asking ourselves before we begin to implement, do we have enough or the right or the key stakeholders that are needed to be able to implement this strategy successfully? If we don't, we need to be doing something about that by broadening out our strategy a little bit to make sure we have a plan for how we're going to engage those stakeholders. We also need to be thinking about buy-in. We know that there's going to be resistance to change. Everyone resists change in most cases, right? Unless it's the change that you want. And so regardless, when we're thinking about creating change in a system, we need to make sure that people are bought in to the need for the change that we're actually intending to create, and how we're going about that. If we don't have that buy-in, that we're going to be really challenged to be successful with our strategy. Another knowable kind of barrier has to do with capacity. And so is there readiness and capacity to implement the change? So you can have good stakeholder engagement, you could have good buy-in, but if you don't have the capacity to actually implement your strategies, then again, you're not probably going to be very successful. So if any of these are an issue, then we need to be able to think about how do we broaden out our strategy, our set of strategies, so that we're addressing these issues either before or as we roll out our other strategies we've already designed. So the great news is that we can design for these barriers up front. If we take the time to reflect on and think about where are we with our engagement and our buy-in and our capacity, for example, then we can think about what do we need to do to address those. On the other hand, we also have what's referred to as unknowable barriers. And these are often hidden. So they may exist, but we just don't know them because they're not in our awareness. They haven't surfaced yet. They can be emergent, meaning, again, they're there, or maybe they're not there, but in the course of implementing our strategy, all of a sudden we become more aware of them, or perhaps in some cases our strategies actually create these emergent barriers. And then often these barriers are also intended. So it wasn't at all part of what we wanted to do with these strategies, but as a result of implementing the strategies, it has happened. So just some examples here include flow issues. So for example, sometimes our strategies create downstream issues that really were never part of the scope of work or what we were considering we were here to do. So for example, maybe in your community, the community decided that they needed to design a coordinated intake system or process. And so they designed a really great process for that, got a lot of stakeholders on board, people were bought in, there was the capacity to begin to act on this coordinated intake process, there was great success. And now, even though they were successful with their strategy, they've actually created a downstream kind of issue where now they've got so many families coming into the system, they don't have enough providers to address all the needs that are now waiting to be met. So that's an example of downstream issues. Another can be unintended consequences. Again, strategies create influences that are not desirable or foreseen. What we just talked about in a way is an unintended consequence, but it could be other unintended consequences. Maybe for some reason, not to your liking at all, but this coordinated intake system actually created more disparities and more inequalities in terms of who's getting served than it was before. And so that certainly wasn't your intention, but it has actually happened. So now what are you going to do about it? And then the third one is problem misidentification. So sometimes it's about once you implement your strategy, all of a sudden you realize that there's new or different root causes that are really critical issues that need to be addressed in order for your strategies to be effective. This is just something that we have to pay attention to, and it may be that those other root causes could never have been known until we began to act, and so that's okay. The whole point here is that we have to pay attention, so we have to discover and then address these barriers during the implementation phase, because that's when we're going to know that they exist. So that's been a lot on the types of common implementation challenges that we may face. I want to take a moment here to invite you to pause and reflect on what we've just been looking at. There are 2 questions for this segment of the webinar. These questions are also on a handout for the that goes along with this webinar. So either take a moment now to pause this recording and reflect on these 2 questions, or when you complete the webinar, take the time to respond on that worksheet. The first question is, what implementation challenges have you experienced or do you know about? The second question, how might knowing about these challenges up front help your network implement more effectively? Okay, so let's build upon our understanding of these challenges and focus more fully on our second objective, which is to understand why system change efforts require an iterative change strategy, design, and implementation approach. So first of all, we know systems work is complex. You know this from all the great work you did to try to understand in the system assessment where the system is breaking down, where it's not working or functioning so well to really help support families as they address some of these issues that they're facing. So systems, it's just complex work. We have multiple systems embedded within systems, and this complexity is challenging to say the least. We also have to acknowledge that we can never fully understand all the issues at play. So despite your best and great efforts to design, to do a system assessment and create a root cause analysis that gives us a picture as accurately as we can of what's going on in the system, we just have to acknowledge that at best, this is just a snapshot in time of what we best understand at that point in time, that there's likely to be emergent and new issues that will surface at any time, regardless of what we do or don't do. And so we work from what we have, and then we just pay attention as we go. We also have to acknowledge that we can never fully know which strategies will work. So while we're going to target very specific root cause change, very specific root cause issues, and we're going to design strategies to target those issues, we still can't know for sure what's going to work in that system because there is so much complexity. It's not a linear cause and effect. Do this strategy, you'll get this result. There's all kinds of factors, conditions, other issues that are happening that will play out and have an influence on our strategies. So what that means is then implementation is also complex with many unknown barriers, right? So we never know, we can't control implementation precisely. Implementation is its own complex process, and in that process we'll probably uncover more barriers that were unknown to us when we started out. And so working with complexity really requires that we are in this continual trial and error process when it comes to strategy design and implementation. So I hope this is not overwhelming. It's a reality check for us to realize that because of all this complexity and all these unknowns, we have to think about implementation in a new way, an expanded way perhaps is a better way to say it, so that we can be successful. So, okay, let's get down to specifics about what this means for strategy, design, and implementation. First, I think we have to just embrace strategy, design, and implementation as an iterative process. We're never going to get it exactly right the first time, and that's okay. We don't have to get it right the first time. And so you have the freedom and the flexibility in this project to embrace that and realize that. And so get started on a small scale, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and then slowly test out and see what works. Design an initial set of strategies, implement them, see what happens. Continually seek to understand and learn what is working and what is not, and then adapt, expand, and or discontinue at some point with your strategies as appropriate. So this is the heart of what it means for us as we think about our strategy design and our implementation process. So now let's look at how implementation is typically addressed, and then we'll look at how we're going to adapt this process in a way that better fits the complexity of a systems approach. So we tend to think about implementation as being a three-part process. First, we design strategies, then we implement the strategies, and then over a period of time, we evaluate for effectiveness. Then we're done. While this simple equation for implementation can be helpful as a high-level concept, in reality, it's really never that simple, especially if you want to be effective. And so the types of implementation problems that we're addressing in the Child and Family Initiative and the types of strategies that are needed are almost always so much more complex that this simple equation never works. So complex problems in complex contexts, so the problems that children and families are experiencing are complex in and of themselves. People are complex. Then you put them in complex family units. Then you put them in complex systems. Then you put them in a complex in community. It's nearly impossible to know which strategies will work and which won't. So we need to experiment or test them out to know. Then we must adapt our strategies depending on what we learn, which means that implementation rarely happens in a linear way. It's almost always an iterative process. So I know many of you know that iterative is one of my most favorite words, and it's for a good reason, because this work, if you want to be in systems work, iterative has to be a favorite word, or at least a word that you're willing to work with. Okay. So again, this simple formula can work for simple problems in simple contexts, but when we're working with complex problem in multiple embedded complex contexts, we need a different approach to strategy, design, and implementation. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right. This is what an iterative system improvement process can look like. Rather than a single effort to implement this strategy, here you can see that implementation actually takes place in cycles over a period of time. The first implementation cycle, shown in the light green, starts with a small scale, what we'll call fail-safe prototyping effort. Here the idea is that you try out a small aspect of the strategy, or try out maybe the full strategy if it's a small strategy, but you just try it out on a very small scale. It's kind of like an experiment to see what works and what doesn't. This will help you see where you may need to adapt the strategy to be more successful. Once you've finished that first cycle and you've adapted the strategy, then you move on to the next cycle where perhaps you implement the full strategy. Again, you will most likely consider doing this in one setting or just with a smaller group of people so that you can try out the entire strategy and see if further adaptations are needed before you move to the next cycle. By the third cycle, you have demonstrated that your strategy is working, and now you can focus on how you can scale your strategy to reach more people and settings. So let's just do a quick example. So for example, let's imagine that you are doing some kind of a training for providers to build their knowledge and capacity to do something in particular. So as you think about this training, it may be that you know that they need to learn more about how to engage in more culturally competent ways. But you're not really sure to what degree they understand that language or that thinking. You're not really sure what their starting point is. So a prototype might be that you're initially just going out and speaking with some of those providers that you eventually hope to train, and you're just getting an understanding of what does that term mean to you? What does it mean to be culturally competent? You're just gathering some information that can help you then decide what it is that you need to include in your training. So you'll reflect on what they told you. You'll think about how you need to build your training so that it's ready to go. Then in the second cycle, you may have put together your full training now, and you're going to go out and you're going to go through a cycle again. And this time you're going to do the whole training with a small group of stakeholders, and you're just going to kind of pilot it. You're going to test it out a little bit, but on a little bit bigger scale, because now you're looking at the full training and see, okay, how does this work when it's all fit together? Again, you'll learn and adapt accordingly, and then after you make those adaptations, you're ready then to begin to scale this and take this training out to more providers in more settings and even perhaps more sectors. So now you see that for us, implementation is an iterative process of implementation, learning, and strategy adaptation until we reach the desired results. This is what we refer to as continuous learning and adaptive action. So now let's take a deeper dive into understanding the 4 parts of the core cycle, which we are referring to as PILA for short. And PILA again stands for prepare, implement, learn, and adapt. Okay. So as you saw in each of the 3 cycles described on the previous slide, each slide is made up of 4 phases. I will go into more detail about each of these phases in the next slide, but for now allow me just to share the big idea of each phase. Okay, so the 4 phases start with prepare, and this is really about getting ready to implement your strategies, and I'll talk about what that might look like in just a minute. The next phase of the cycle is what we're referring to as implement, and this is where we actually initiate the strategy, so we begin to take action, and while we're doing that, we are supporting the effective implementation of that strategy or that prototyping that we're doing as we go. The third phase is what we refer to as learn, and this is where we take time to reflect on what we understand about what worked or what didn't from the implementation that we just did. And then based on that learning, we can then move to the adapt phase, where we think more specifically about how do we need to modify that strategy or expand it or scale it, depending on what cycle we're in, so that we can be the most effective we can possibly be. This basic cycle is repeated with adaptations to the strategy and implementation until the desired result is achieved, just like we just talked about. Before we go on, I want to pause for a moment to call your attention to how our cycle relates to other popular quality and continuous improvement processes. You may be familiar or heard of Edward Deming's PDCA, or sometimes it's referred to as a PDSA cycle, which stands for plan, do, check or study, or act and adjust. These are very popular and used in a number of settings to enhance quality and or create an environment for continuous improvement. And so while I did not set out to actually use a PDSA cycle, as you can see, that really is what this is, because what all of these processes really share or have in common is that they acknowledge that complex problems require very adaptive learning processes to discover and get to what works and to continually improve and increase our quality. So if you're familiar with those, this might seem very familiar. Okay, so let's go into a little more detail about each of these phases to give you a better sense of what it looks like. I want to call your attention to an additional handout called the Continuous Learning and Adaptive Action Course Cycle Details. This is just provided as a little kind of cheat sheet to just help you remember what exactly is it that we need to be paying attention to or doing during each phase of the cycle. Now, these details that I'm going to go through may vary a little bit depending if you're on a first cycle, a second cycle, or a third cycle. So we'll get into some more of that in later webinars. But for now, I just want you to get a sense of what's kind of involved with each phase. Okay. So in the first phase of prepare, what we're really doing here is doing things like, are we engaging stakeholders? Do we have the right stakeholders involved to help us be able to implement our strategy? If not, how are we going to get them engaged? We need to think about whether or not we need to or want to gather some additional input from stakeholders. We need to figure out whether we need to garner more support from stakeholders. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about there. We may also find that we need to develop some materials or processes. So maybe it's the training that we're going to be providing, whether we're just prototyping or ready to launch it, we still need to put some things together for that training. So we have to do that before we can go and start training people. If we're developing a coordinated intake process, we got to spend some time developing that coordinated intake process before we actually implement it. So that's what we're talking about there. You may also need to think about what kinds of evaluation processes, or even just how are you going to measure the effectiveness of your strategy. You may want to get that all figured out before you start implementing so that you're ready to not only implement but also to be able to track the data that you want so that you know if your strategy is working well or not. And then the last one is around building capacity. So if you're going to have other people that are going to help in the actual implementation of the strategy, do they need any training? What information do they need to know to be able to implement well? How are you going to have feedback from them as they start to implement to know if things are going okay or if they need any support? So these are all the kinds of things we need to be thinking about in the prepare. So even though we may have designed our strategies and we got the basic idea down for what we want to do, there's often more work that actually has to happen before we begin to put the strategy in place. For implement, in this phase, this will vary what you're doing depending on whether you're in cycle 1, 2, or 3, or so on. So as I have suggested, I really want to encourage that the first cycle, you're prototyping in some way or to some degree, that you're not just going full force forward with your full strategy, that you just kind of test the waters a little bit before you go and do a deeper dive. Later on, though, you may be actually ready to take that deeper dive where you're implementing the full strategy, which may be launching a full training or something like that, or maybe later phases where you're ready to now go out and start doing this training on a broader scale in more places with more people, at the same time. One of the critical things that needs to be done during the implementation, regardless of what cycle you're in, is making sure that you're following up with those implementers, whether they're the trainers that are providing the training, whether they're other people that are in organizations or agencies that are beginning to implement new strategies, like actually using the coordinated intake procedure. But you got to be able to be in touch with them and follow up, and they need to be able to get a hold of someone from the network that can answer questions if they run into challenges or want to provide some feedback along the way. And then of course, as you're going, you do need to have the system in place. So how are you going to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on through this implementation process? Not only so that you'll be able to then eventually go to the next phase and learn from that, but also so that maybe you have the opportunity in real time to make some course corrections with your strategy in this very cycle, not have to wait till the next cycle goes by. In the learn phase, as we talked about before, it's really about assessing what worked or what didn't work. Now, obviously, it's possible to also be doing some of that learning in the implementation phase, so learning why you're doing. But having learn here as a separate phase just reminds us that even if we do that while we're implementing, we also have to take time out after we've implemented whatever we were implementing to do some deeper reflection so that we can really assess in a powerful way what is working so that we can continue to build upon that, but also what didn't work so well so that we can course correct, adapt our, or expand our strategies so that we are on point towards making the changes that we want. And of course, we're also always paying attention to new opportunities and or barriers that emerge. So these are some of those unknowable barriers or opportunities that we can only know once we kind of start to take action. So we want to be able to recognize those and so that we can capitalize on those opportunities or address the barriers so that we don't get derailed. And then finally, the last phase is the adapt phase. And this again will also vary a little bit depending on what cycle you're in, but basically what we're doing here is we are, based on what we learned from this cycle, we're trying to figure out what do we need to change before we go into the next cycle. So if we just did a training and there were some great parts, but there were some parts that need a little tweaking, now we're actually doing that tweaking. We're identifying, you know what, we are going to change A, B, and C in the training. D's fine, and part E, well, that one's okay too. So we're just really acknowledging what it is that we need to do differently before we move on. And then we move into the next cycle. So there'll be more about this in future webinars, but for now, I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so in our continuous learning adaptive action, implementation, learning, and strategy adaptation are really merged into a continuous process that continues until we achieve the desired results. Strategy design is enhanced and or adapted throughout each cycle, making it more powerful and effective with each phase as we go. So in this way, we begin to see, again, the iterative nature of this work. Strategy design isn't something that we do and then we're done. Strategy design actually continues into our implementation process. And as we learn what's working and what's not, we are adapting or expanding those strategies until we get to a place where we are confident that we are doing the right thing, and then we begin to scale it so that when we do our bigger evaluation of the overall effectiveness of our efforts, we are pleased with the results that we have created. So it's time to take another pause for reflection. In this section, there are 3 questions I'd like you to either pause right now and jot down in your notes, or you can wait and respond to these at the end of the webinar. The questions for this segment are, what does PILA stand for? That's an acronym that we'll be using a lot, so let's make sure we're clear on what that means. What is your understanding of and or experience with continuous improvement cycles like the one we use for AOK, like the ones from Edward Deming, Plan, Do, Study, Act, or Plan, Do, Check, Adjust? And finally, how might our continuous learning and adaptive action approach help networks address the implementation challenges we talked about at the beginning of this webinar? This is a really important question to spend some time with because I think it will be very helpful for you to be able to articulate the answer to this question when you're working with stakeholders so that they really understand why it's critical that we work through this continuous improvement process to make sure that we can get to the results that we're after. Okay. So the last segment of this webinar, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about prototyping and providing a few tips on how to go about doing it, and then we'll wrap up. So prototyping and piloting, I want to make a distinction between the two, and so let's start first by what we mean by prototyping. Often these terms get used interchangeably, but from my understanding, they're similar, but they're also important distinctions. So prototyping for me is the smaller, quick start on testing out what a strategy, for example. So I like to think of them as like little experiments to test out a strategy. Maybe it's even just to test out a concept or an idea that we have for something, or could even be an assumption that we're just trying to figure out, is this really accurate? But it's essentially a way of getting rapid feedback back on a small part of the strategy. So sometimes you might prototype a full strategy if it's a small strategy, but it's just taking a small piece. We're just kind of testing it out because what we want to be able to do is what's called fail fast. And fail fast means that, first of all, it's okay to fail, and it's certainly better to fail with just a little trial of something than going full scale with a big trial of something and then for it to fail. So if we can fail fast and then learn and adapt before we expand it, we're going to waste a lot less time. We're going to be able to move forward much more quickly in a much smarter way because we tested something out before we spent a lot of time planning, before we executed, to only find out that what we planned was off base in some way. So that's what I think of when I think of prototyping, and that's what I'm inviting you to think about as we talk about prototyping for this project. Piloting, on the other hand, is usually a little bit bigger scale. So it may be a full strategy, it may be you know, a small set of strategies that you're piloting before you're expanding it out and using those strategies with more people and more settings. But the idea here is that prototype starts small, little experiment. Piloting is a little bit bigger of an experiment. You're pretty confident that what you have in the pilot is ready to go, but before you really fully launch it more broadly, you're going to put it all together, try it out somewhere, make your last little tweaks to it, then you're ready to launch it on a much bigger scale. So I also just want to point out that prototyping can come in different forms. So on the smallest scale, it could just be that you're getting input from critical stakeholders. Let's say there was the providers that you were hoping to influence with your training or get to use this new coordinated intake process. You're going to maybe want to just talk to them first. Use our user-centered focus to better understand where they're coming from, what their needs are, how they think about whatever your training topic is, or this coordinated intake, to really understand what it's like to be them. So as you design strategy to help them either learn to do something differently or begin to practice do things in a different way, you've already really took your time to understand what they're going to need to make sure that you're designing for them and in a way that will help them embrace the change that you're inviting them to make. Another option is that's maybe a little bit bigger in scale is to test the water, so to speak. So maybe you have a part of that training, whether it's a concept or it's a particular segment of the training, that you just want to go out and run that by some people before you more fully flesh it out or before you embed it in the rest of the training to see, are they on board? Are we thinking and talking about this in a way that makes sense to people? Because you're going to build on this, and you certainly would want to make sure that that's rock solid before you go ahead and expand on it. And then finally, sometimes prototyping, it takes a deeper dive. Often this is where you're ready to move more into the kind of piloting version of this testing. And that's where you've got that full training design now, and now you're got a small group of willing participants who are willing to engage in that training and give you feedback on how it went, so that then you can make your last set of refinements, and then you're ready to go out and work with more groups in a variety of settings. So those are some different ways to think about how you could do your prototyping. All right, so why would you want a prototype? Let's just address that before we start to move towards wrapping up here. All right, so one reason you might want a prototype is that you don't have all the information you'd like to have before you execute your strategy. We just talked about that, for example, in the training example. You don't really know how people think about a certain topic or what they need to understand or what they want to understand. So you're going out and you're getting that information from them up front. Maybe you have a lot of information, but you're still not quite sure what's going to work. So you just want to go out and test it out a little bit, see how people respond, and then you can adapt. Maybe you just would feel more confident in engaging a broader range of stakeholders if you could show that the strategy has merit. Maybe you've tried to run the strategy by a few people and they're just like, I don't know if that's going to work. And so to solve that problem, you go out and you prototype it so that you come back and say, hey, you know what? I know that there was some concern about this, but we tried this out with a few people and this is what we learned. And then another option is that maybe you want to learn how you can enhance your strategy before you implement it on a broader scale. So maybe you've already done some small testing, prototyping, piloting, and now you're pretty good about this, but you just want to enhance it a little bit more. So you go prototype one more time. So I'm sure there are other reasons you can think of why and when it might be appropriate to prototype. These are only just a few examples to just get you thinking about how it might apply to your initiative. All right, last thing about prototyping. I want to talk just a little bit more about the prepare phase when you're in a prototyping cycle. It's really important that you're really clear about the purpose, the people, the format, and the feedback that you're after. So when I talk about purpose, what I mean is, like, what are your questions? What do you really want to learn from this prototyping? A lot of times people go out and they start prototyping, but they're not even really kind of super focused on what they want to learn from those that they engage in the prototyping process. So then they don't really learn much, and it really wasn't a very good use of their time. So just be super clear, what do we want to learn through this cycle before you engage in executing on that cycle. Also, be really clear about who you want to involve. Who are the best people to give you the information or the feedback that you're seeking? Who are the people that are most representative of the group of people that this strategy is actually targeting? They're going to be a better barometer of whether this strategy or what you want to do is on point than someone that is really has no idea about the issue that you're focused on, or is not the kind of person that you would even be targeting for your strategy. Format has to do with just kind of what form the prototype takes. I want to encourage you to just like the quickest, downest, dirtiest, kind of smallest scale tests that you can do, especially in the first cycle, just to get some immediate, quick, rapid feedback on whether you're on the right track or not. Again, in a training context, using that example, maybe there's a concept around this cultural competence that you want to see, what's the language or what's the frame that people use when they think about that. You may just want to go out and find that out. You may want to, maybe you've already select one that you think you want to use for your training, but now you're just going to go out and say, if I talk about this in this way, does this make sense? Does this resonate? Does this fit with what you already may have heard about the topic? So you're just checking some of those things out. And then finally, feedback. like we talked about earlier, you gotta be clear not only of what you want to learn, but how are you gonna collect that information? How are you gonna know and get the answers to your questions? So make sure you have a good process for that. All right. So once the planning for the prototype is complete, obviously you implement it, you prototype it, right? Then you reflect on what you learned and you determine how your strategy may need to be adapted. This in itself is a continuous learning adaptive action cycle. Now you move to the next cycle and plan how you will implement um, your revised strategy on a larger scale. And then once you've done that and learned and adapt, you're going to go ahead and you might scale it up in a bigger, broader way. So this will look a little bit differently depending on what your strategies are, how complex your strategies are, how robust your strategies are. So there's no one right way to do this. The prototype, the implement full strategy, the scale implementation, those are just offered as a kind of a general way of thinking about this. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to be in contact and we can talk that through. But I hope the concept of the differentiations, how these cycles evolve and build upon one another over time, has been clear. All right. So again, just a couple more slides and we're going to be wrapping up, but I do want to again invite you to pause and reflect on what we've just talked about in terms of prototyping. And to really think about how prototyping can improve your strategies and your implementation effectiveness. Okay, so let's move to wrapping up our webinar. So how can strategies become more effective through implementation? This really is the central question of this webinar. So despite the complexity of our work, the answer is actually, I think, quite simple. It's really about preparing, implementing, learning, adapting, and then repeating the process until we get to the desired results. We have to, when we prepare, we have to do our due diligence in making sure we're ready to implement. So we can't usually go directly from strategy design into implementing our strategies. Quite often there's some work that still needs to be done to be ready to implement on those strategies. Then when we implement, think about how you're going to start out by testing your strategies and then over time moving into full-fledged implementation. We have to always keep a learning focus to what we're doing, and especially we need to take time out after we implement to reflect on what worked and what did not. Then we have to adapt. How did our strategies work that we can continue to enhance and build on that, and where do we need to make some changes so that we can be more effective in the next cycle? And then, as I said, repeat the process until we get the desired results. So to summarize our webinar today, let's just remember that even the most powerful, well-designed strategies will fail if implementation is ineffective. That system complexity and a variety of knowable and unknowable barriers get in the way of effective implementation, just the way it is. But that we can design for knowable implementation challenges up front, but we must take the time to reflect on what's knowable, know our current situation so we can design appropriately. And we can rely on our continuous learning adaptive action process to help us uncover unknowable implementation challenges and adapt our strategies until we find what works. So it's okay we don't know it all when we get started. All we have to do is have an open mind to discovering it and then addressing it as we go. And finally, prototyping our strategies is a fail-fast opportunity to learn about unforeseen implementation challenges and quickly adapt strategies before implementing more fully. So there'll be more to come on our continuous learning and adaptive action process. I thank you for your time and listening to this webinar. I want to remind you to take time out to reflect on the questions that we paused on for during this webinar. And I look forward to sharing more on this topic in our next webinar. Thank you.